The market district of Venteris Prime was a place where survival meant looking straight ahead and never stopping. Towering megastructures loomed overhead, their metal skeletons wrapped in pulsating neon signs, advertising anything from cybernetic implants to cheap synth food. The air carried the acrid tang of burning fuel, mingling with the sharp scent of rain-soaked stone. Deep in the underbelly of the city, where the artificial sunlights barely reached, the streets were a patchwork of forgotten souls. Dustin navigated the labyrinthine alleys with ease, his steps steady but purposeless. He wasn't here for business. Not really. He'd been in Sector 12 long enough to know that coming down to the lower markets meant either looking for trouble or trying to forget something. He supposed in his case it was both. His jacket was heavy against his shoulders, lined with reinforced plating beneath worn-out fabric, a habit he hadn't shaken since leaving the war behind. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but some things stuck. His eyes scanned the street automatically, not really looking for anything, but always watching. Old instincts died hard. A sudden tug at his sleeve made him stop. "Human, no one helps my mom." The voice was small, barely louder than the hum of the rain against the steel awnings. Dustin glanced down. A little girl stood before him, her green skin dull beneath the artificial lights. She was tiny, her arms wrapped tightly around herself beneath a thin, threadbare tunic that hung from her small frame like discarded fabric. Her eyes, large and dark, were the kind of eyes that had seen too much. "She cries every night since my dad left. We've been cold in the streets, we've been eating from the garbage for days." Dustin felt something tighten in his chest. He had seen hunger before. He had seen desperation. But this was abandonment. This was something worse. He turned his gaze past her, scanning the movement of the crowd. The people of Venteris Prime walked in long, hurried strides, eyes fixed ahead, conversations whispered and brief. No one slowed. No one looked down. This was a city that did not stop for the weak. "Where's your mom?" he asked, his voice even. The girl hesitated for only a moment before she lifted a trembling hand and pointed toward a narrow alley. Dustin followed her gaze. She was there, hunched beneath the overhang of a rusted maintenance shaft, long black hair draped over her face like a curtain. The dim market lights barely reached her, but even from here, he could see the gauntness in her features. She was beautiful in a way that exhaustion hadn't yet managed to erode. High cheekbones, sharp jawline, golden eyes that flickered warily beneath thick lashes. Her green skin, deep and rich in color where it wasn't marred by grime, marked her as Tsali, one of the native species of Venteris Prime. And yet, despite her obvious suffering, she held herself with rigid dignity. Even wrapped in her tattered cloak, even with her thin frame curled inward from the cold, she looked at him with a sharpness that hadn't dulled. "I don't need your pity, human," she said. Her voice was hoarse, like she hadn't spoken in days. "Good," Dustin answered, tilting his head slightly. "Because I'm not offering it. Just some food, a warm place to stay for the night, if you don't mind staying dry." Her gaze didn't waver. He could see the calculations in her eyes, the hesitation coiling in her muscles. She was used to rejection, used to cruelty, and most of all, she was used to people who offered kindness with strings attached. "Mama!" The little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, voice barely above a whisper. "Please." The word was so small, so fragile, that it cracked something in the air between them. Sahari exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders faltering just slightly. She was still wary, still guarded, but she looked down at her daughter, brushing a strand of damp hair from the girl's face with trembling fingers. And then, finally, she nodded. Dustin didn't miss the way the girl sagged with relief, nor the way Sahari pulled her cloak tighter around herself, as if bracing for something worse. He had seen it before, the instinct of someone who expected kindness to turn cruel. "All right," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Dustin nodded once and turned. "Come on." They followed. The journey back wasn't far, but it felt like crossing an invisible threshold. The streets grew quieter as they left the chaotic pulse of the market behind, the flickering neon glow giving way to dim industrial corridors and rusted overpasses. Dustin's place wasn't much. A reinforced steel door, an old biometric lock that barely worked, and a single, cramped room inside. The air smelled of metal and cheap coffee, but at least it was warm. The hum of the climate unit filled the space, steady and constant. The little girl stepped inside first, her bare feet soundless against the floor. Her eyes darted around, scanning the unfamiliar space with something between curiosity and apprehension. "This place smells nice," she announced after a moment. Dustin raised a brow. "What's it smell like?" She tilted her head. "Like not outside." A dry chuckle escaped him. "Guess I'll take that as a compliment." Sahari lingered in the doorway, arms still wrapped around herself. She looked at the couch, then the walls, then at him. "One night," she said firmly. Dustin met her gaze, then nodded. "One night." She exhaled, stepping fully inside, and the door sealed shut behind her. A moment passed, heavy with something unspoken. And then, from the quiet, a tiny voice. "Mama, do you think we'll ever have a home again?" Sahari's expression didn't change, but her fingers curled slightly around the fabric of her cloak. There was a long pause before she answered. "I don't know, my love." Dustin didn't say anything, but as he watched them settle, watched the little girl curl up against her mother's side, seeking warmth she could barely offer, he realized something. They weren't the only ones trying to figure out what home meant. The rain hadn't stopped. It drummed a steady rhythm against the reinforced window, the neon lights of Venteris Prime casting long, shifting shadows across the room. The little girl, small and fragile in the dim glow, slept curled against her mother's side, her tiny fingers gripping the fabric of Sahari's cloak as if it were the only thing tethering her to this world. Dustin sat in the old chair near the window, elbows resting on his knees, gaze unfocused. The weight of the day pressed against his skull like a dull ache, but sleep didn't come easy. It never did. He should have walked away. Should have ignored the tug at his sleeve, the pleading eyes, the way the girl's voice had cracked when she spoke of hunger and cold. He'd learned, long ago, that stepping in meant dragging yourself into someone else's ruin. And yet, here he was. He exhaled, tilting his head back against the chair. Sahari hadn't moved in the last hour, but he knew she wasn't asleep. She was too still, too rigid, her breathing too controlled. She was waiting. For what? He wasn't sure. For him to demand something? To change his mind? To throw them out? That's what people did, wasn't it? She shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket around the girl's small frame. "You still don't trust me." Her head turned just a fraction, golden eyes glinting in the dark. "Should I?" Dustin huffed a quiet laugh. "Probably not." Silence stretched between them, the only sound the distant hum of the city outside. "Then why?" she asked finally. "Why what? Why do this?" Her fingers brushed absently over the child's tangled hair. No one else did. Dustin let out a slow breath, running a hand over his face. It was a fair question, one he wasn't sure he had an answer for. "Guess I've seen enough people left in the gutter to know it never ends well," he muttered. Sahari's gaze didn't waver. "That's not a reason." "No," he admitted. "It's not." She didn't press him further, and he was grateful for it. Minutes passed, stretching into something softer, something almost resembling peace. Then the girl whimpered. It was quiet at first, just a shift in her breathing. But then her small body trembled, fingers twitching against the fabric of her mother's cloak. "No." The words slipped from her lips, barely audible, laced with something raw and broken. Sahari's entire body tensed. "Nala." Her voice was tight, urgent. The girl didn't wake. Her breaths came quicker now, uneven, her hands clenching into fists. "No, please." A whimper, sharp and desperate. Sahari moved before Dustin could react. In a blink, she was off the couch, crouched beside her daughter, hands gripping the girl's arms. Her breathing was shallow, her entire frame wound tight like a coiled spring. "Nala, wake up," she urged, voice shaking. "It's just a dream. Just a dream, my love." The girl jerked suddenly, eyes snapping open, wild and unfocused. For a split second, she looked terrified. Dustin had seen that look before. on soldiers fresh from battle, on refugees whose homes had been burned to the ground. Sahari hushed her softly, running a hand through her hair, whispering something in a language Dustin didn't recognize. Slowly, Nala's breathing evened out, the panic fading into exhaustion. She blinked, dazed, and pressed her face into her mother's chest. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, voice thick with sleep. Sahari's fingers trembled as they stroked her daughter's back. "You have nothing to be sorry for, my love." Dustin felt something twist in his gut. She had been ready to fight. In that split second, she had braced herself for danger, like a mother expecting someone to rip her child away from her. How many times had she woken up like this? How many nights had they spent in places where nightmares were the least of their fears? Dustin exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. Bad dreams. Sahari looked up at him, something unreadable in her gaze. She remembers more than she should, she said finally. Dustin didn't ask what that meant. Didn't ask what Nala had seen, what had driven them to the streets, what had left the girl waking up in a panic, expecting something worse than shadows. He already knew the answer. Instead, he stood and walked to the small kitchen unit in the corner. The cupboards were mostly bare. He hadn't exactly been planning for company, but there was enough. He pulled out a metal container, filling a small cup with warm liquid before walking back over. Sahari eyed him warily as he handed it to her. "For her," he said simply. She hesitated, then took the cup. The moment the warmth reached her fingers, something in her shoulders eased just slightly. She tilted it carefully to Nala's lips. The little girl sipped, blinking sleepily, her small hands clutching the edge of her mother's cloak. "It's sweet," she murmured. "Good," Dustin said, leaning against the wall. "Should help with the dreams." Sahari studied him for a long moment, not with suspicion, but with something quieter, something closer to understanding. "Thank you." It was barely a whisper. Dustin nodded, pretending not to notice the way her hands still shook. Neither of them spoke after that. The rain kept falling outside, washing the city clean. But inside, for the first time in a long time, there was warmth. The scent of synthetic rations still lingered in the air, mixing with the faint metallic tang of the apartment's filtration system. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, but the world beyond the reinforced window remained drenched in mist. The streets of Venteris Prime never truly slept. Yet in this quiet pocket of the city, time seemed to stretch and settle. Dustin sat at the small table, his fingers curled around a chipped metal mug, its contents long gone cold. Across from him, Sahari remained perched on the edge of the couch, still wrapped in the thin blanket he'd given her. She hadn't truly relaxed. Not yet. Nala, now awake, sat cross-legged on the floor between them, swinging her tiny feet as she finished the last of her meal. The little girl had brightened considerably since last night, no longer just a fragile shadow pressed against her mother's side, but a child. A hungry, curious child who was currently inspecting Dustin's old datapad with wide, fascinated eyes. Sahari, however, remained distant, watchful. The wariness in her golden gaze had not faded overnight. Dustin leaned back slightly, studying her in return. "If you're staying in my home," he said, voice steady but calm, "we should probably stop pretending we don't exist to each other." Sahari's fingers twitched slightly where they rested on her lap. "I know you don't trust me," he continued. "I don't expect you to. But your kid walked up to a stranger in the middle of the market and asked for help. That means we're past the point of silence." Sahari exhaled slowly, glancing at Nala, who was now poking the edges of the datapad screen, fascinated by the way it lit up under her touch. "Fine," she said at last, the word reluctant but resigned. She lifted her chin slightly, as if forcing herself to make this a formal acknowledgement. "My name is Sahari." Dustin nodded. "Dustin," a small voice piped up before he could say anything else. "I'm Nala." The little girl beamed up at him, her green eyes wide with the kind of unguarded enthusiasm that children seem to possess no matter how harsh their world was. Dustin let out a small chuckle, something easing in his chest at the sound. "Nice to meet you, Nala." She grinned before glancing back down at the datapad. "What's this?" she asked, poking the screen again. It's an old system interface, Dustin replied, reaching over and tapping a few buttons. The screen flickered, bringing up a navigation map, faded with age, but still functional. Used to be for ship coordinates, but now it's just junk I haven't gotten around to tossing. Nala gasped dramatically. A ship? Did you fly one? Dustin hesitated. A long time ago, he admitted. Nala's eyes sparkled with something close to awe. I knew it. I dreamed about a spaceship, remember? Mama, remember? Sahari's shoulders went rigid. I remember, she murmured. Dustin watched her carefully. Something about that dream had unsettled her, though he wasn't sure why. Nala, oblivious to the tension in the air, continued her interrogation. Where did you go? Did you fight bad guys? Did you see other planets? Dustin let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. I traveled, he said simply. Did some things I believed in. Did some things I didn't. Nala tilted her head. Do you miss it? Dustin opened his mouth, then closed it again. Sometimes, he said after a moment. But I don't think I'd go back. Nala considered this, then nodded as if she understood something far beyond her years. I wouldn't go back either, she said matter-of-factly. Sahari stiffened slightly. Dustin studied the little girl. Back where? Before, Nala said, as if that explained everything. When it was just me and Mama, and everyone pretended we weren't there. The word struck something deep, something raw. Sahari looked away. Nala, she said quietly. That's enough. The little girl pouted slightly, but didn't argue. Dustin set the datapad down, rubbing his hands together before exhaling through his nose. What happened? He asked finally. His voice wasn't pressing, just steady. Sahari tensed, but she didn't lash out. She didn't deflect. For the first time, she simply looked tired. I told you already, she said, voice quieter now. My mate left. There was no work for our kind. No future. But you stayed. Yes. Why? Sahari's golden eyes flickered toward Nala. Because she deserved more than being forgotten. Dustin's jaw tightened. And instead, you ended up on the streets. Sahari let out a soft, bitter breath. I thought I could endure it. Thought I could survive long enough to prove I still had worth. Dustin didn't reply right away. Instead, he glanced at Nala, still absorbed in the datapad, and then back at Sahari. You still think you have to prove it? Sahari's fingers curled slightly against the blanket draped over her lap. I don't know anymore. The words were quiet, honest, for a long moment. The only sound was the distant hum of the city beyond the window. Dustin exhaled, pushing himself up from his chair. He walked to the kitchen unit, grabbed 2 more mugs, and filled them with what little instant coffee he had left. It wasn't much, but it was warm. He placed one in front of Sahari before sitting back down. She stared at it. What's this for? I don't know, Dustin said, leaning back. Maybe because you look like you could use it. Sahari hesitated, then cautiously picked up the mug. She held it between her hands, as if testing its warmth. Nala, finally looking up, wrinkled her nose. Coffee is gross. Dustin smirked. You'll learn to appreciate it when you're older. Nala made a dramatic, gagging noise before laughing. Sahari didn't laugh, but she did take a sip, and for the first time since she had stepped into his apartment, she looked just a little less like she was waiting for everything to fall apart. Dustin watched her carefully. They weren't gone yet, but maybe, just maybe, they weren't leaving either. The artificial morning light hummed to life outside, casting a dull glow through the reinforced window. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind streets slick with moisture, neon lights reflecting in scattered puddles. Venteris Prime was awake again, but inside Dustin's small apartment, time moved slower. Sahari sat at the small table, shoulders rigid as she wrapped her hands around a cup of coffee she hadn't truly touched. She was still here. That in itself surprised him. She had made it clear one night, but now morning had come, and she hadn't bolted. Nala, on the other hand, had fully made herself at home. The little girl sat cross-legged on the floor, completely immersed in the imaginary battle she had created, using 2 mismatched tools from Dustin's workbench. And then, boom, she declared, slamming the 2 objects together in what he could only assume was a dramatic space explosion. Dustin smirked, leaning against the counter. What are you playing? Nala looked up, her dark green eyes wide with excitement. It's a space battle, she explained eagerly. This one is the captain. She's super smart and never loses a fight. Dustin nodded. Sounds like a good captain. She beamed and lifted the second object, a slightly rusted multi-tool. And this one is the grumpy mechanic, she continued. He doesn't like people, but he's actually really nice if you give him snacks. Dustin raised an eyebrow, glancing at Sahari. That's supposed to be me? Sahari let out a breath that was dangerously close to amusement. Seems accurate, she murmured. Nala giggled, entirely unaware of the tension that still lingered in the air between the adults. But Dustin wasn't just focused on her game. Now that the morning light was filtering in properly, he was getting his first real look at them. They had been on the streets for a long time. Their clothes were worn, stiff with dried rain and dirt. Sahari's dark hair, though still striking, had lost its shine beneath layers of grime. Even Nala's small hands bore the smudges of survival, her green skin dulled by dust. Dustin set down his coffee with a sigh. All right, he said, pushing off the counter. First things first, you need a shower. Sahari's gaze snapped up, her body immediately tensing. Excuse me. You heard me, Dustin said, gesturing toward the small bathroom tucked in the corner of the apartment. There's hot water, soap, towels. You should use them. Sahari's jaw tightened. We're fine. You're not. He crossed his arms, giving her a pointed look. I can smell both of you from here. Nala gasped dramatically, sniffing at her own arm. Do you stink? Dustin smirked. A little. The little girl frowned, then turned to her mother. Mama, can we? Please? I want to be clean. Sahari inhaled sharply, torn between pride and necessity. Dustin didn't press further. He could already see the battle waging in her mind. The instinct to reject help, the ingrained belief that accepting kindness came with consequences. But this wasn't charity. This was basic survival. Finally, Sahari let out a slow breath. Fine. Nala cheered, scrambling to her feet. Dustin pulled out 2 clean towels from a storage compartment and handed them over. There's soap in there. The water pressure's a little aggressive, so don't let it knock you over. Nala grabbed the towels eagerly, her excitement outweighing any hesitation her mother had. Sahari, still tense, took them with far more caution. She didn't thank him, but she gave a small, stiff nod before ushering her daughter toward the bathroom. The door closed behind them, and for the first time since they had entered his apartment, Dustin was alone. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. This was not what he had expected when he woke up yesterday. Hell, this wasn't what he had expected when he woke up this morning. He wasn't sure why he cared so much. He had spent years looking out for himself, avoiding unnecessary attachments. Yet here he was, making sure a mother and child strangers had food, warmth, and now, even a hot shower. Maybe it was because he saw something in them, a reflection of a past he didn't talk about. He shook the thought away and busied himself preparing something to eat. The food wasn't much, just rehydrated meal packs and a bit of dried fruit he had stashed away, but it was better than nothing. The sound of running water filled the apartment, a steady hum that somehow made the space feel different, lived in. By the time the door finally reopened, a cloud of steam spilling into the cooler air, Nala emerged first. Wrapped in an oversized towel, her damp green skin now fresh and vibrant. Dustin, look! She spread her arms dramatically. I'm all clean. He let out a low whistle. Much better. Almost didn't recognize you. She giggled, spinning in place before trotting over to the table. Sahari followed behind her, the second towel wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her long black hair, now wet and clinging to her skin, framed her sharp features in a way that made her look almost like a different person. But what struck Dustin the most was how much more at ease she seemed. She was still guarded, still stiff, but some of the exhaustion that had clung to her like a second skin had washed away with the dirt. She met his gaze briefly before looking away. That was unnecessary, she muttered, but there was no real bite to the words. Maybe, Dustin admitted, setting a plate of food in front of Nala. But it didn't kill you, did it? She huffed, but sat down without further argument. Nala, now fully invested in breakfast, eagerly grabbed her utensils. Dustin, this is so much better than garbage food, she declared. Dustin snorted. I should hope so. Sahari picked at her meal with a bit more caution, though after the first bite, her shoulders relaxed ever so slightly. For the first time, the silence wasn't tense. It was comfortable. Nala, now fully awake and full of energy, went right back to playing her space battle, her small hands making explosion noises as she knocked her makeshift captain against her grumpy mechanic. Boom! The captain dodges at the last second, she narrated. But the enemy ship is too fast. Dustin leaned back, watching her with an amused smirk. And where's the grumpy mechanic in all this? Nala grinned. He's fixing the ship because captains break everything. Sahari made a soft noise, almost a laugh, but not quite. Dustin chuckled. Smart kid. Nala beamed. And just like that, the apartment felt a little less empty. The apartment smelled different. Not just of coffee and rehydrated meal packs, but of people, of warm skin and damp towels, of blankets that had been wrapped around a sleeping child, of something lingering in the air that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just a place anymore. It breathed. Dustin noticed it in the little things. The second cup of tea sitting on the table, the small blanket bunched up on the couch where Nala had curled up earlier, the faint trace of steam still clinging to the air from their earlier shower. And he wasn't sure how he felt about it. He had spent years keeping his doors closed, letting people in meant watching them leave. Or worse. But here they were, still here. Across the room, Nala sat cross-legged on the floor, completely absorbed in her imaginary battle. She had two mismatched tools in her hands, one held high like a triumphant hero, the other dangling limply in her lap, as if it had suffered a terrible fate. Captain Zara dodges the asteroids, she declared, swinging the spaceship through the air. But the engines are failing. Mechanic Gus, fix it. She turned dramatically and shoved the rusted multi-tool into Dustin's hands. You're Gus, she announced, as if bestowing a great honor. Dustin raised an eyebrow. Thought I was just grumpy mechanic. Now you have a name, Nala said matter-of-factly. And a very important job. From the table, Sahari let out a quiet breath. Almost a laugh, but not quite. Fitting, she murmured into her cup. Dustin shot her a look, then sighed and turned the tool over in his hands, pretending to inspect it. All right, Captain, he said seriously. Looks like your power core is shot. Gonna take at least 5 hours to fix. Nala gasped. 5 hours? We don't have that long. We'll crash. Then you better hope I work fast. He crouched down beside her, frowning in mock concentration as he twisted an invisible bolt, adjusted a non-existent circuit, and tapped the tool against his palm like a seasoned engineer diagnosing a complex issue. Hand me the hydro spanner, he muttered. Nala blinked. What's a hydro spanner? Exactly. She giggled, delighted, and eagerly handed him another random tool from the pile she had gathered. Sahari shook her head. You're encouraging her. She assigned me a job, Dustin replied with a shrug. I take my work very seriously. Nala beamed. You're officially part of the crew now. Dustin felt something shift inside him at that. He hadn't planned for any of this, hadn't expected to care. But here he was playing along with a child's game as if it meant something. And maybe to her it did. All right, he said, straightening. Engines are back online, but you owe me a new power core. Nala saluted. I'll pay you in space credits. Dustin smirked. I'll only take snacks. She gasped as if this was a very serious demand, then reached for a piece of dried fruit from her plate and carefully placed it in his palm. Deal, she said solemnly. Dustin popped the fruit into his mouth, chewing thoughtfully. Pleasure doing business with you, Captain. Sahari let out a quiet sigh, shaking her head. And for the first time since she had stepped into his apartment, she looked at ease. The rest of the morning passed in rare, unspoken comfort. Dustin busied himself tidying up. Not that there was much to clean. He lived simply. No clutter, no excess. Just the essentials. And yet, somehow, the space already felt fuller than it had the day before. After breakfast, he pulled out a few old blankets and set them on the couch. Figured you might want something softer than a pile of rations to sleep on, he said. Sahari hesitated, but took them without protest. Nala, meanwhile, had decided to explore every inch of the apartment. "What's in here?" she asked, pointing at a closed cabinet. "Tools. And here. More tools." She wrinkled her nose. "You need better stuff." Dustin huffed a quiet laugh. "Yeah, well, I wasn't exactly expecting company." She seemed to accept that answer and continued her exploration, eventually settling back near Sahari, pressing into her mother's side. Dustin sat across from them, resting his forearms on his knees. "So," he said, looking at Sahari, "what's your plan?" Her fingers curled slightly around the fabric of the blanket. "We'll leave soon," she said. "Right?" Dustin wasn't sure why that confirmation made his chest feel heavier than it should. "You don't have to rush," he said after a moment. "It's not like I've got a waiting list of people trying to stay here." Sahari's golden eyes met his, searching. "Why do you care?" Her voice wasn't sharp, wasn't accusatory, just cautious, wary. Dustin ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "Because I've been there," he admitted. "Not exactly like you, but close enough." Sahari didn't respond right away, but something in her posture shifted. Not trust, not yet, but maybe less resistance. Nala yawned, stretching her small arms before climbing onto the couch, curling into the blankets Dustin had given them. "Mama," she mumbled sleepily, "do we have to go?" Sahari's expression faltered. Dustin pretended not to notice the way her fingers brushed against Nala's hair, the way her shoulders tensed to the question. "Not yet," she murmured. Nala hummed in response, already halfway to sleep. The quiet settled again, heavier this time. Dustin leaned back, looking at Sahari once more. "One night," she whispered, almost to herself. Dustin nodded. "One night." But they both knew it wasn't true anymore. The soft hum of the climate unit filled the apartment, steady and rhythmic, blending with the distant murmur of the city outside. The artificial lights beyond the window bathed the room in a muted glow, flickering against the metal walls. It was late, late enough that Venteris Prime had slipped into its quieter hours, though the planet never truly slept. Dustin sat at the small kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a half-empty mug of lukewarm coffee. Across from him, Sahari was silent, her hands resting loosely around her own cup, her golden eyes unreadable as she stared at nothing in particular. Nala had fallen asleep on the couch, buried beneath the blankets Dustin had given her. One small hand peeked out, fingers curled slightly in sleep, her slow, steady breathing the only real sign of peace in the room. They should have left by now, Sahari had said one night. She had told herself, told him, that this was temporary. But morning had passed, then afternoon, then evening, and still they hadn't moved. And neither of them had mentioned it. Dustin exhaled, setting his mug down with a quiet clink. "You're still here." Sahari tensed slightly, the fingers of one hand curling around the edge of her cup. "It's late." It wasn't an answer. Dustin leaned back, stretching his legs out in front of him, studying her. "That's not why." Sahari's jaw tightened. She knew it. He knew it. But saying it aloud would make it real. A long pause stretched between them, neither of them willing to break it first. Finally, Sahari let out a slow breath, her shoulders sinking slightly. "She's happy here." She didn't need to specify who. Dustin glanced at the couch, at the small bundle of warmth tucked beneath the blankets. Nala had settled into this space like it belonged to her, like she had already decided this was home. And maybe in some quiet, unspoken way, Sahari had too. That a bad thing? Dustin asked. Sahari hesitated. "It makes leaving harder." Her voice was quieter now, like she was admitting something she wasn't sure she wanted to say. Dustin nodded slowly. "So don't." Sahari let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking her head. "You say that like it's simple." "Maybe it is. For you, maybe." Dustin frowned, but before he could respond, Sahari continued, her voice measured but tight. "I can't just pretend this is normal, that we belong here. You helped us, and I appreciate that. But Nala and we're not." She exhaled sharply, gripping the cup between her fingers. "We don't fit anywhere. Not in the streets. Not in the market. Not here." "She seems to fit just fine," Dustin pointed out. Sahari's gaze flickered to her daughter, something complicated flashing across her expression. She's a child, she murmured. She doesn't understand how fragile this is, how quickly it can be taken away. Dustin's jaw tightened. Then maybe it's your job to make sure it isn't. Sahari's breath caught, just for a second. There it was, that small crack in her armor, the moment of hesitation before she could rebuild her walls. Dustin didn't press further. He had learned a long time ago that some people needed space to walk toward their own decisions instead of being pushed. So he stood, stretching as he grabbed his now empty mug and walked toward the sink. "Stay or go," he said, his voice even. "It's your choice. I'm not keeping you here." Sahari watched him for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. Then, finally, she exhaled slow and quiet. "I know." Neither of them said anything else. And for now, that was enough. Later that night, Dustin stirred from sleep at the sound of soft footsteps. He opened one eye, barely lifting his head from where he had dozed off in the chair near the window. Nala stood near the couch, half awake, blinking sleepily at him. Her small hands clutched the edge of the blanket draped over her shoulders, her dark green skin illuminated softly by the glow of the city lights filtering through the window. "Dustin," she mumbled. "Yeah." His voice was rough with sleep. "Can I have water?" Dustin grunted in acknowledgement, pushing himself up and moving toward the kitchen. He filled a small cup from the sink, then handed it to her. She took it carefully, drinking in slow, sleepy sips before handing it back. "Thank you." He nodded, but Nala didn't move. She stood there for a second, shifting slightly on her feet, hesitant. "Mama likes it here," she said finally. Dustin glanced toward the couch, where Sahari still slept, curled slightly on her side. "Yeah," he said, keeping his voice quiet. Nala nodded. "She won't say it, but I know." Dustin studied the little girl, the way she spoke with quiet certainty, as if she understood her mother better than Sahari understood herself. "You want to stay?" he asked. Nala hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. Dustin sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You tell her that?" Nala shook her head. "She gets scared when I say things like that." Dustin frowned. "Why?" Nala shrugged, then yawned, rubbing at her eyes. "She's afraid of losing things, so she doesn't keep them." Something in Dustin's chest tightened. "Go back to sleep, kid," he said softly. Nala blinked up at him, then gave a sleepy smile. "Good night, Dustin." He didn't say it back, just watched as she padded back toward the couch, curling into the warmth of her mother's side. Dustin exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck as he glanced toward the window. Maybe Sahari was afraid of keeping things, but that didn't mean she wasn't meant to. The soft hum of the city seeped through the apartment's thin walls, a steady rhythm of distant voices, hovering drones, and the occasional flicker of neon signs reflecting off damp metal surfaces. The artificial glow outside bathed the room in pale light, stretching long shadows across the floor, reaching toward the small couch where Sahari and Nala lay curled together beneath the blankets. Dustin sat at the table, arms folded, staring at nothing in particular. He should have been asleep, but something kept him awake. Maybe it was the conversation from earlier, the way Sahari had looked at him, like he had said something dangerous. Like he had given her a choice she hadn't allowed herself to consider. Or maybe it was what Nala had whispered before shuffling back under the blankets. She's afraid of losing things, so she doesn't keep them. That thought dug into him deeper than it should have. Across the room, Sahari stirred. She shifted beneath the blanket, brow furrowing slightly before her golden eyes fluttered open. It took her a moment to remember where she was, her gaze flicking around the dimly lit space before landing on him. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then she carefully pushed herself up, moving quietly so she wouldn't wake Nala, and crossed the room toward him. "You don't sleep much, do you?" she murmured, her voice still heavy with exhaustion. "Not if I can help it." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, watching him. "Why?" Dustin smirked, but there was no real amusement behind it. "Old habit." Sahari studied him for a long moment, then glanced at the empty chair across from him before settling into it. "She talks about you." Dustin blinked, caught off guard. "Ooh, Nala." Sahari's fingers traced the rim of her empty cup, her movements slow, thoughtful. She already trusts you. Dustin wasn't sure how to respond to that. He hadn't tried to earn the kid's trust. He had simply done what felt right. Given them food, a warm place to stay, let Nala turn his apartment into a battleground for imaginary space wars. Is that a problem? He asked finally. Sahari let out a breath, her shoulders tightening. It's unexpected. Dustin frowned. Unexpected how? People don't usually stay. The words were quiet, matter of fact, as if she wasn't just talking about him, but about everyone who had come before. Not even her father? Dustin asked. Sahari's jaw tightened, her fingers stilling against the cup. He left before she was old enough to remember him. There was no bitterness in her voice, no anger, just a quiet, hollow sort of acceptance. I used to tell her stories, that he was out there somewhere, trying to find us. That one day, he'd come back. Dustin didn't have to ask what changed. And now, Sahari looked toward the couch, at the small, sleeping bundle curled beneath the blankets. Now she doesn't ask anymore. The weight of those words settled between them. Dustin exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. He had seen this before, different names, different faces, but the same ache left behind. The same struggle to move forward while pretending not to look back. You don't have to keep running, he said. Sahari tensed. I'm not running. Dustin tilted his head slightly, watching her. Aren't you? She flinched just slightly. He let the silence stretch, let her sit in it before he continued, his voice quieter now, but firm. You think if you don't hold on to something, you can't lose it. That if you don't let yourself want anything, it won't hurt when it's gone. His gaze didn't waver. But that's not surviving, Sahari. That's just waiting to disappear. Sahari's breath hitched. She looked away, fingers tightening around the fabric of the blanket, her posture rigid, defensive. It's not that simple, she murmured. No, Dustin admitted. But it's not as complicated as you make it, either. Her jaw clenched. He could see it. The way she wanted to argue, the way she wanted to push him back to that safe distance where she kept everyone. But for the first time, she didn't. She just sat there, staring at her daughter, and let the quiet settle around her. And for Dustin, that was enough. For now, the apartment was quiet. Not the kind of empty silence Dustin was used to, but something softer, something filled with the slow rhythm of breathing, the quiet rustle of fabric, the warmth of another presence. Morning had come, though the artificial sky of Venteris Prime didn't offer much of sunrise. The city outside pulsed with its usual hum, but inside, the world had slowed. Dustin sat at the small table, a cup of coffee cradled between his hands, watching as Sahari folded one of the blankets. Her movements were precise, careful, like she was trying to keep herself busy, like she was trying to convince herself she was leaving. Across the room, Nala was still asleep, curled into the couch, her tiny fingers twitching slightly as she dreamed. You're still here, Dustin murmured. Sahari's hands stilled for half a second before she continued folding. I know. Dustin exhaled through his nose, setting his cup down. You're not going, are you? Sahari let out a breath, not looking at him. I don't know. She stood there for a moment, staring at the neatly folded blanket in her hands as if it held all the answers. Then, finally, she sat down across from him, shoulders stiff. I'm afraid, she admitted quietly. Dustin didn't move, didn't say anything right away. He just let the words settle. Of what? He asked. Sahari swallowed. Of stopping. Of letting myself believe this is real. That it could last. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Every time I've let myself think we were safe, that we had something, it was taken away. Her voice was steady, but there was something raw underneath it. If I don't let myself want this, then it won't hurt when it's gone. Dustin studied her carefully. So that's it? He asked. You'd rather have nothing than risk losing something real? Sahari flinched just slightly. It's not that simple. It is, Dustin said, his voice firm but quiet. You keep running because it's easier than staying. But you don't have to. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. Not to me. Not to the people who turned their backs on you. And sure as hell not to the guy who left you behind. Sahari's jaw tightened, but she didn't look away this time. You want to go? Dustin continued. Fine, go. But don't pretend it's because you have to. The silence stretched between them, heavy, charged with something unspoken. Then, slowly, Sahari exhaled. I don't want to go, she admitted. But I don't know how to stay. Dustin leaned back slightly, watching her, then shook his head. You're already doing it, he said. Sahari blinked. Dustin gestured toward Nala, still curled up on the couch, her tiny form nestled into the blankets like she belonged there. She knows, he said simply. She knew before you did. Sahari looked at her daughter, something flickering in her golden eyes. Then, finally, her shoulders loosened just slightly. Dustin let out a quiet breath and stood, stretching before moving toward the kitchen. Hungry? He asked over his shoulder. Sahari hesitated. Then, softly, so softly he almost didn't hear it, she said, Yeah, it wasn't much, but it was enough. Dustin noticed it in the way Sahari moved, not with the rigid tension she always carried, but with something softer, quieter, like she was finally allowing herself to exist here, in this moment, without bracing for it to be taken away. Nala had fallen asleep again, curled up beneath the blankets on the couch, one hand loosely wrapped around the edge of the fabric. The slow, even rise and fall of her breathing filled the silence between them. Sahari stood near the small kitchen unit, her fingers grazing the rim of a cup she hadn't taken a sip from yet. Dustin leaned against the counter, arms crossed over his chest, watching her. You're thinking too hard, he murmured. She exhaled, shaking her head slightly. I don't know how to stop. Dustin smirked, pushing off the counter. Want me to hit you over the head? Might do the trick. Sahari shot him a dry look, but there was a flicker of something else in her expression. Amusement, familiarity, something dangerous and fragile all at once. Dustin moved closer without thinking. Not much, just a step, just enough that he could see the way her breathing changed, the way her fingers curled slightly against the counter. I don't understand you, she admitted, her voice quieter now. I get that a lot. Sahari huffed a quiet laugh, shaking her head. No, you don't. Dustin tilted his head slightly. Then explain it to me. She hesitated, her golden eyes flickering over his face like she was searching for something. You're not afraid of this. Dustin frowned. Of what? Sahari swallowed. Of wanting something. Ah, so that was what this was about. Dustin let out a slow breath, considering his words carefully. I used to be, he admitted. Used to think keeping people at a distance was easier. Safer. Sahari's gaze didn't waver. And now? Dustin shrugged, but there was no nonchalance in it. Just quiet honesty. Now, I think some things are worth the risk. Silence stretched between them, heavy with things neither of them were saying. Then, slowly, cautiously, Sahari reached out. Just a small movement, her fingers brushing against his forearm, the touch barely there. But it was enough. Dustin inhaled sharply, his pulse kicking up in a way he hadn't expected. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. This is dangerous, she murmured, but there was no real warning in her voice. Dustin smirked, his voice low. I thought you liked dangerous things. Sahari exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. You're an idiot. Yeah. His hand lifted, almost on instinct, fingers ghosting over her wrist, tracing the warmth of her skin. But you're still standing here. She was. And that was the only answer he needed. The space between them disappeared in slow, deliberate inches. No hesitation, no second-guessing, just the inevitable pull of something they had both been circling for far too long. Dustin didn't rush it, didn't press. He just let it happen. The moment her lips met his, soft and hesitant, he felt something settle deep in his chest. Something quiet and certain. Something that tasted a lot like home. The scent of something warm and familiar pulled Dustin from sleep before the soft hum of the city fully registered. It wasn't the usual sterile scent of rehydrated meal packs or stale coffee. No, this was different, richer, fuller. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then, as the last traces of sleep faded, he heard the quiet clinking of dishes, the hushed sound of movement from the small kitchen unit. Sahari. Dustin blinked, rubbing a hand over his face before pushing himself up. The blanket that had been draped over him slipped down to the floor. He didn't even remember pulling it over himself the night before. With a yawn, he stood and stretched before making his way toward the kitchen, the scent of food growing stronger. There she was. Sahari stood by the small stove, her back to him, long dark hair still slightly tousled from sleep. She moved with quiet focus, stirring something in a pan while steam curled up into the air. Nala was perched on a chair nearby, swinging her legs back and forth as she watched with bright eyes. "Mama's making breakfast," she announced proudly, noticing Dustin before Sahari did. Sahari glanced over her shoulder, a hint of something softer in her expression. "It's not much," she said almost shyly, "but you fed us enough times. I thought I'd return the favor." Dustin smirked, leaning against the doorway. "I didn't know you could cook." Sahari rolled her eyes, turning back to the stove. "I managed just fine before you came along, human." "Sure you did." She huffed, but didn't argue. Dustin took a slow breath, letting the scene settle into him, imprint itself in his mind. This was new, different. He wasn't used to waking up to this. The warmth of someone else moving through his space like they belonged there. The easy rhythm of shared silence, of a morning that didn't feel rushed or uncertain. It felt natural. It felt right. He stepped closer, resting a hand lightly against the small of Sahari's back as he peered over her shoulder at the pan. "Smells good." She stiffened for just a second at the touch, then, almost imperceptibly, leaned into it. "You'll eat anything," she murmured, but there was no bite in her words. "True," Dustin admitted, letting his fingers brush against her waist before he pulled away. Sahari shot him a glance, half amused, half exasperated, but there was something else in her gaze too. Something softer, something she wasn't running from anymore. Nala, watching the exchange, grinned. "We're a good family now," she declared, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Dustin blinked. Sahari inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening slightly on the spoon she was holding. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Sahari turned, meeting Dustin's gaze. "She's not wrong," he murmured. Sahari swallowed, something unreadable flickering across her expression. And then, before she could second-guess herself, before she could retreat into old habits, she leaned in. It was soft, tentative, barely more than a brush of lips. A quiet confirmation of something that had been there for longer than either of them had been willing to admit. When she pulled away, Dustin exhaled, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I could get used to this." Sahari huffed, shaking her head, but the warmth in her gaze betrayed her. "Eat your breakfast, human." And for the first time in a long time, they weren't running. They were home.